My name is H.J. Lee, and I'm the founder and the president of KoreanAmericanStory.org. Thank you all for joining us this evening. And I'd like to thank the folks at the Korea Society for providing such a beautiful venue and also to co-sponsor this evening's book reading. I'd also like to thank our three authors, Yuliana, Kathy, and Eugenia, for sharing your stories with us this evening as well. Before we begin the book reading, I'd like to take a few minutes to tell you about our organization, KoreanAmericanStory.org. We're a nonprofit organization whose mission is to create and to preserve the stories of individual Korean Americans through works of art in all medium in order to preserve our collective experience. Why stories? Here's a short excerpt from a gentleman named Simon Kelly of Adweek, of all places, which best summarizes our beliefs. He said, "Stories define us. Since early cave dwellers left their graffiti, listening to and telling stories have moved people. Stories are powerful. They give meaning and context to what would otherwise be a collection of easily forgettable facts. Stories invoke the imagination so that the listener begins to own them as almost as much as the teller. In fact, there's a growing body of research that points to the power of narrative, not just as a way to engage people, but as the only way to change deeply entrenched views. We are about capturing the stories of Korean Americans, but as a nation of immigrants, our stories are really stories of all Americans. We want other Korean Americans to know that while we share common experiences, as a growing community, we are becoming more diverse. At the same time, we also want to share our stories with the greater American community, showing that while our stories may be unique in some ways, they are all about our shared humanity. We hope that this will strengthen and build connection between all of us. This year, our big initiative is an oral history project called the Legacy Project. We're asking the older generation, Korean Americans, to share their stories with their children and their grandchildren at our recording studio. At the end of the recording, the participating family will get a copy of the video that they can preserve for their family. With the family's consent, we take some of these videos and edit them to a 2 to 4 minute segment, which will be shared on our website in order to encourage others to begin their own intergenerational dialogue. For those of you that are familiar with StoryCorps, it's very much like that. I'm sure you too have stories from your own families that you'd like to preserve, and I hope that you can join us in our future recording sessions of the Legacy Project. If you're interested in seeing an example of the Legacy Project video, or if you're interested in finding out more about it, please see me or one of the other members of KoreanAmericanStory.org. Now I'd like to invite up Julie Young to introduce our authors. Thank you.
Good evening. My name is Julie Young, and I'm on the board of directors for Korean American Story, and I also write a monthly column for them called Heart and Soul. Let me get right to it. Catherine Chung was born in Evanston, Illinois, and grew up in New York, New Jersey, and Michigan. She studied mathematics at the University of Chicago and received her MFA from Cornell. She is one of Granta's new voices and lives here in the city. Here now to read from her debut novel, Forgotten Country, please welcome Catherine Chung.
Been told I don't have to stand in that precarious ledge while I read. So, thank you so much for coming. It's a real thrill for me to be here, especially with Yuliana and Eugenia. Can you guys all hear me? All right, okay. I'll be reading from the opening of my novel, which is about a Korean American family that thinks that it might be cursed to lose a daughter in every generation. And after the family moves to America, the youngest daughter, when she's in college, sort of cuts ties with her family. And the older sister is asked by her family to go and find her. And that's where the book opens. So, the year that Hannah disappeared, the first frost came early, killing everything in the garden. It took the cantaloupe and the tomatoes. The leaves of lettuce turned brittle and snapped. Even the kale withered and died. In front, the wine-colored roses froze, powdered gray with the cold, like silk flowers in an attic covered with dust. My father and I had planted the garden over several weekends and tended it carefully. Then it had overgrown itself, the tomatoes winding themselves up the wall of our house and stretching out to span the distance to the fence. After the frost, we'd left it all winter without trimming anything back. Now we stood on the lawn, surveying the ruin, tracking damp patches of ground wherever we stepped. "We're selling the house," my father said, blowing warm air on his hands. "That makes sense," I said, but it felt suddenly difficult to breathe. My parents had told me they were going back to Korea, so I'd known that selling our house was a possibility, but I hadn't expected it. "We're going to have to clean this up," my father said, gesturing at the garden. "It's cold," I said. "Let's go inside." He nodded. The tendons in his neck were taut. His breath steamed slowly around his face. Everything was inside out, or at least the cold had turned the insides of things visible. The green tomatoes were now gray and translucent, their skins puckered at the stems, still hanging from their frozen vines. "We want you to find Hannah," he said. "When are you leaving?" I asked. "As soon as possible," my father said. "I want to go with you." My father shook his head. "Find your sister," he said. He had blamed me after the initial panic, when we discovered that Hannah hadn't been abducted or killed, but had simply left without telling us, without leaving us a way to contact her. I was her older sister, living in the same city. He thought I should have seen it coming. When I moved back home for the summer, my father grilled me about her. He wanted to know everything about the months prior to her departure, what she had looked like, what she had said, what I had noticed, why I hadn't noticed more. He was already sick then, but didn't know it yet. I wonder if Hannah would have been able to pick up and leave like that if she had known. It was the year I became a math major that Hannah and I started growing apart. She never understood my chosen field and considered it a defection to my father's fortress of reason and logic. "You can't even divide up a bill," she said. "You're horrible with numbers." I tried to tell her about complex and imaginary numbers, primes and transcendentals, numbers with families and personalities, but she rolled her eyes. "I don't know how you can think any of that is important," she said. She was studying to become a biologist, deep in the gunk of life and committed to saving the earth, and could see no beauty in what I did. But math had come with me from Korea to America, and its familiarity had pulled me through those first bewildering years. I liked its solidity, the possibility of discovering a truth around which no further argument need swirl. And Hannah was right to feel left behind, maybe even betrayed, because something changed between my father and me when I started talking shop with him. My father had always wanted a son. We women were unreliable creatures, prone to fits of emotion and flights from logic that generally ended with him at the receiving end of a pointed finger. "Yes," he'd said when I told him I decided to study math. He reached out his hand and said, "Shake." While he pumped my hand up and down, he said, "Math lasts." One day in the summer after my sophomore year of college, my father and I tried to construct the 17 gun with a straight edge and compass. As we talked, something in him eased up and fell away. He laughed, made jokes about our family in mathematical terminology. When we talked math, the words flowed, pure and easy. Here were rules we could both abide by. Here was a language that was eloquent and spoke to us about the world. Later, we sat in our backyard going over what I thought at the time was a particularly complex proof. My mother's roses were in bloom at the edge of our lawn, and we could smell them faintly, their perfume drifting over on the occasional breeze. A beetle flew onto the picnic table and landed on our paper. "Do you see this beetle?" my father said, pointing at its shiny back with his pencil. "Just think, it's mathematical fact. Even the tiniest insect has as many points on its back as the entire universe." He tapped his pencil by the beetle several times. "Life is like that," he mused. "Think about it. The tiniest insect contains infinity on its back. Each life contains as much meaning as all of history." Then he leaned forward and blew a quick, sharp breath on the beetle, which unfolded tiny translucent wings, lifted into the wind, and flew away. I called Hannah that night. She was spending the summer in Chicago. I said, "Who knew? Dad's getting mushy." I felt like a traitor as soon as I said it, but I had to put the sarcastic note in to get her to listen. "Not interested," she said. Hannah had called me a couple days before she disappeared, crying because the baby of a woman she worked with had died the night before. I'd suddenly hit a wall in my dissertation, and when Hannah called, I hadn't slept for days and had spent the morning pacing, swiping at a blackboard I had put up in my living room. "He's dead," Hannah wept when I answered the phone. "Who's dead?" "The baby," Hannah sobbed. "What baby?" "Marjorie's, a woman from work." A wave of relief passed over me. "Jesus Christ," I said. "Are you trying to scare me to death?" "Her neighbor's children threw her baby out the window while she was at work." "Who was watching it?" I asked. "His brother." "How's your friend?" There was a sharp intake of breath. "How do you think?" And then a pause. "I'm not really close to her. I tried to find her phone number, but it's not listed." "Hannah, that's awful," I said. And then I wrote, "What the fuck," on my blackboard, quietly, so she couldn't hear the chalk. On cue, Hannah started to cry again. "Stop," I said. She didn't even know these people. "They were only 12 years old," she said. "I don't know how to deal with this." I didn't respond, outraged somehow that she could take this woman's tragedy and try to make it personal, as though the world hurt her in particular and no one else. Some people have real problems, I wanted to say. That woman whose baby died, she has problems. "Hannah, please don't cry," I said, but that only made her cry harder. I waited for her to stop. I could think of nothing to say that would help. A couple months after Hannah disappeared, the kids who had thrown the baby out the window went on trial. I followed the case out of some perverse loyalty. It turned out Marjorie wasn't a colleague of Hannah's, but a cleaning lady who worked in her building. She lived not in Hannah's trendy North Side neighborhood, but in one of the South Side housing projects. Her surviving son's name was Kevin. He was 10 years old. The neighbor's kids had been giving him trouble for some time. The lock on his door had been broken for weeks, and they had come to rifle through the things in his house, to eat his mother's food. When they came, he was sitting on the sofa watching cartoons. His baby brother was in his lap. Roadrunner was outwitting Wile E. Coyote, whose Acme mail-order products never quite got the job done. Boulders, buildings, pianos hung suspended in air a beat too long. Roadrunner zoomed fearlessly beneath impending doom, but Wile E. Coyote, always too slow, was flattened on the desert landscape. That day, his neighbors asked Kevin for candy. They pulled his baby brother out of his lap and pushed him. He began to cry, but he had no candy. So they held his brother, dangling him by his legs out the window. His brother loved it, gurgled with laughter, held 17 stories above the ground. Kevin's eyes met the boys who held his little brother. There was no sound when the boys let go. Through the open window, they saw an empty sky. Kevin turned and ran out the door of his apartment. His feet pounded 100 separate steps. He didn't know about the laws of gravity or physics. He imagined his brother hung, suspended in the air. He thought if he could just make it down in time, he could catch his little brother before he hit. He ran down the stairs and out the door, his gaze aimed at the sky, his arms outstretched. After the trial, I couldn't sleep at night. I stopped working on my dissertation and stopped answering phone calls from my friends. I stayed up thinking how I should have done things differently. When Hannah called, I should have taken a movie over to her place and some tea and told her our old jokes until she laughed. At night, I should have lain in bed next to her and stuck my feet between her legs and asked if she remembered how mad she used to get when I did that. I should have wrapped my arms around her and talked about places we'd lived and games we had played until she was wrapped up in the comfort of who we used to be. Where was she, I wondered. In those days, I lost weight and watched my parents suffer. I should have spent that night with her, I thought. If I could have done it differently, I wouldn't, no matter what, have said nothing and let her go. Thank you.
I'm not sure where the microphone is, so I'm going to read this. Eugenia Kim. Eugenia Kim is the daughter of Korean parents who came to the U.S. soon after the Pacific War. The Calligrapher's daughter. Her first book won the Borders Original Voices Award and was a Washington Post Best Historical Novel. She teaches at the MFA in Creative Writing program at Fairfield University. Please welcome Eugenia Kim.
Hello, it's really, really bright up here. I'm going to talk a little bit, and then I'm going to read. I want to talk about my parents because this book is about their lives. But I also want to say that what an honor it is to be here and to be reading with Yuliana and Kathy, whose books I greatly admire, and that you must get if you haven't. So, as Julie said, my parents came to the U.S. shortly after the Pacific War, and so they came in 1948 at a time when there were very few Koreans in the U.S. They were married in Pyongyang early in the 1930s during the Japanese colonial period. And both of them were planning to travel to America to study. My father, theology, my mother, obstetrics. They had both been accepted with scholarship to different universities. My father heard from a policeman friend of his that the ports would soon close because tensions with Japan and China were mounting, and it was greatly feared that Japan would soon go to war with China. So he made his plans long before, and right after the day they got married, he got on a boat and left for America. The plan was that my mother would follow him as soon as her papers would be approved. She would get on the next possible ship and then meet him in the U.S., in L.A. But when she went to get her papers, her traveling documents, the Japanese official told her, "I'm sorry, if you want to study nursing or medicine, you should study at Tokyo University. It's one of the best universities in the world." And so her papers were denied. Thus began a decades-long separation between my parents. She was stuck in Pyongyang, a married woman, and she did what every married woman would do at the time. She went to live with her parents, her in-laws. Now, my mother was an aristocratic, very kind of proudful woman. And she never imagined that she would stay long at her in-laws, so she hadn't really prepared anything. And what she discovered when she got there was this enormous poverty. It wasn't that they were poor, but he was a minister and he lived in humble poverty because of that. And so for 2 years, she suffered under what she considers slave-like conditions, taking care of their house, taking care of the dirt floor and a baby that had arrived that was somebody else's baby. And she never told my father how miserable she was those 2 years. She never said how much she hated it because it would be so dishonorable for her to do that. But she certainly told me. Only after he died, though. I mean, she talked about, sleeping in a closet because there was no room for her on the floor, things like that. So she was living there, and she finally escaped from there because her mother sent a letter to the in-laws saying, "I'm very ill. Please let my daughter come and take care of me." Well, it was a lie. She did it for her daughter, to save her daughter. My father then spent the next 10 years in the U.S. studying theology and sociology, and then he was trying to find a way to get back. But by then he had heard that because he had associations with America, that if he came back, he would be arrested. So he was afraid of that, and also he didn't have the fare to come back. So in order to continue living and going to school, he continued to get scholarships. He went to, I think, 4 or 5 different universities, became a minister, became ordained as a Presbyterian minister. And then later, as World War II escalated, he joined the OSS and was a translator of Chinese, Korean, and Japanese. Not so much Korean because they didn't need it then, but Chinese, Japanese, and English. So he wanted to come back, obviously, but after Pearl Harbor, it was even more difficult. What he didn't know was that my mother's family and she herself suffered persecution by the Japanese because of his letters to her from America. So she was imprisoned, and their property was confiscated. So the war finally ended, and then he tried to find a way back home. And he thought, let me go to the presbytery, the people who gave me my ordination, because they're sending missionaries to Korea. So he went there, and they said, "I'm sorry, the missionaries that have just come back say that the Korean people are not ready for an indigenous person to be a missionary to them." So that didn't work out. So he joined the U.S. Army as a civilian field officer, and became a translator for General Hodge, who was in charge of the U.S. military government in Korea. So in the meantime, my mother also was looking for a way to find her husband. She had previously lived in Kaesong, but when that house was confiscated, they moved to Seoul. So he didn't know where they were, and she didn't know how to tell him. This was now, the war is over. The country is in upheaval. There's no mail, no reliable mail. So she pushed beyond her Korean propriety to meet an American GI that she saw who had a cross around his neck. She was a very Christian woman. And they became friends. And she asked him, what can I do? How can I find my husband? And he lived in New Jersey. So she was like, oh, New Jersey, Princeton, so that's how their conversation started. And she had been studying English. So he became a friend to the family. And through him, she sent a letter to the APO, to the New York Presbytery. And eventually it reached my father. So I'm going to read what happens next, but I also just sort of want to mention that what happened, the reason they came to the U.S. in 1948 was my father had become very Americanized in the 10 years that he was here. And he would do dishes, he would wash diapers. For a Korean man, this was unheard of. And she couldn't believe it. Like, what's wrong with you? So he wanted to show her that a little bit of American life. And also, I think he felt remorse for their long separation. So he brought her to the U.S. in 48. And they had 3 children in Korea by then. And then they stayed here. And then he found out that he was also wanted by the communists. My poor father, he's just wanted by everybody in a bad way. And that if he came back, he would be kidnapped by the infiltrators from the north. And so he was warned by his own father not to come back. So he didn't return, and then the Korean War broke out, and so he didn't return until late in the 1970s, back to his country. And the reason why I want to bring this up is because this is the reason why they became Korean Americans, and as a result, the last of their 6 children, the 3 that were born here, have become a Korean American person. And for that reason, I applaud and I support the Korean American Story.org, and also give much thanks to the Korea Society, who helped to blend the two cultures and the two countries' knowledge of each other. So I'm going to read. This is October 1945. So the war ended in August 15th, is it? 1945, and the U.S. soldiers started to appear in Seoul in September of that year. So this is October. This is from the point of view of what is the fictional character of my mother, whose name is Najin. The GI soldier that she met, I've given him the name of Private Forbes. In the house that she lives in Seoul, she lives with her parents, grandmother and grandfather, and her younger brother, whose name is, his name is Il-sun, but they call him Tongxiang, younger brother, and younger brother's wife, Mija, and their child, Sanok. So those are the residents of the house, and it's been, in this story, 11 years since their separation. And she is also beginning to experience Christian doubt because of all the horror and the difficult things that she's seen in her life. A Korean dressed like a GI. The damp autumn wind predicted rain. It seeped stiffness into my hips and knees, hinting at loss of youth and making me worry about my mother's painful joints. I wrapped an old blanket around my shoulders and slid my feet into Tongxiang's torn and battered leather shoes, glad that he now sported a decent pair, courtesy of GI Forbes, who had visited us several times since that day I met him by the roadside. Tongxiang had gone downtown to meet someone about designing a logo. He'd gained notoriety when he redesigned into Hangul the masthead of the Donga Ilbo, which was featured in its first Korean language issue. Seoul artist restores traditional Korean calligraphy. Soon, he was called upon by editors feeding the explosion of new newspapers and magazines in the city, people who fervently expressed their politics and opinions in wondrously free and open press. Tongxiang's earnings first went to rice, then art supplies and a little treat for Sonok, and with outrageously inflated prices, the money evaporated like hot breath on a cold day. Luckily, our diet was supplemented by the generosity of Private Forbes, who brought gifts of military kit rations and tins of cookies. I went to reap the last of the vegetables from the garden, an empty crock in hand, fretting over the impossibility of repaying Neil Forbes's kindness. A vehicle passed the house and honked. I thought it odd that a car would drive through this remote neighborhood, but my main concern was if the cabbages had yielded a few more leaves. I slid the door open, the broken soles of Tongxiang's ruined shoes flapping on the threshold. A man said, "Yabo." The sound of his voice alone made me scream. My hands flew to my face and the crock smashed on the steps. It was an apparition, I was sure, grown out of hunger from the depths of my memory. He touched my elbow. I turned and met eyes as serious and calming as I remembered. But how strange! Here was the face of a ghost, a thought, a glimpse in a mirror, and yet here he was, my husband, real, smiling, crying like a child, and handsomely dressed in an olive drab military coat and hat. How? He clasped my hands and said, so softly I wasn't sure if I heard correctly, "Forgive me, never again, never." Tongxiang ran from the jeep parked on the road. "Look who I found! 할아버지, 할머님, 여보, 형님, brother-in-law, come in! Nuna, don't just stand there, make him welcome!" I was aware of my faded dress, the tattered shoes, gnarls on my palms and deepened lines on my face, the broken bowl forgotten. I drew him indoors, my heart beating as if for the first time. Calvin greeted my parents with a bow to the floor. "My deepest respects, father and mother-in-law. Profound regret for the hardships you have suffered." Yes, look at the prodigal son, come back as an American soldier," said grandfather. He reached for Calvin's hand and held it a moment in both of his. Come in. Daughters, something to eat and drink." "I found him at the Bando Hotel. Can you imagine?" Tongxiang crowed. "We came right home." Amid the confusion of introductions to Mija and baby Sonok, the surprise of his monochromatic army uniform beneath his coat, and the repeated cries of wonder, I dashed to the kitchen, patted down my sleeves and skirt, and hastily wiped water on my face and hair. I slapped my cheeks as much to ensure I wasn't asleep as to put color in them. In the sitting room, as I served drinking water and a tin of cookies, I saw that Calvin kept his eyes on my every move, and I felt him smile when I smiled as grandfather took 3 cookies for Sonok in his lap. "I'm sorry that I come unprepared," said Calvin. "My hands are empty today, but my heart is full." If I hadn't been completely stunned by his presence, I might have been embarrassed by the tears that wet my husband's cheeks once more. When I sat across from him, grandmother nudged me to sit next to him, preferring to see his features, to watch him sitting in this room, talking, drinking, breathing. I didn't move. Grandfather asked him to pray. "Father in heaven," began Calvin. When he gave thanks for this reunion, he paused a moment to collect himself, and I peeked at his face. His cheeks seemed rounder, his jaw softer, his mouth fuller. His eyebrows were a little wild, but his skin shone with the same polished gleam that I remembered from when I first saw his photograph. He was much the same, yet completely different somehow. Even the way he sat on the floor seemed foreign. 1,000 questions flooded my mind. How did he manage to get here? Was he a minister now? Did he really know how to drive a jeep? And what was the meaning of those colorful patches and bright insignia on his clothing? I closed my eyes, nearly laughing out loud at the sheer joy and shock of him, and at my mounting impatience for him to quit praying so we could talk. Finally, I sensed he was winding down, and I closed my eyes as he prayed for our liberated country, that its leaders find the strength, compassion, and wisdom they need to undertake the tasks of rebuilding and uniting us as a democratic, self-determined, free nation. During our recitation of the Lord's Prayer, I remember our years ago conversation about the Protestants and self-determination, and excitement sparked when I thought that discussions barely begun could be continued. Then I quaked, for he was not some fellow student to bandy intellectual ideas about, but my husband, now obviously a man of God, and I, his wife, a Christian hypocrite. Shame and anxiety surfaced for a moment, but were easily lost in the excitement of his being there. The ritual of prayer gave me time to gather my spinning feelings. "Amen," said grandfather. "Thank you, Calvin. You've completed your minister education, I see." Warned by the gentility Calvin's formal intonation had restored in rooms that had long missed such civility, my blood soon became a tranquil current calming my pulse and thawing my heart. Yabo, I said, the familiar address feeling as foreign on my tongue as if sitting across from me. How is it that you came here in this American military uniform? It's impossible to think it mere coincidence. Calvin looked directly into my eyes. It was amazing, said Tongxiang. I flew into Kempo this morning and just checked in with Army headquarters at the Bando Hotel. I requisitioned a jeep right away and set out to find this house. He reached into his breast pocket. Yabo, I received your letter 2 days before I left New York. How wise to write me in care of the presbytery. You're writing alone. I cannot express to you the joy, your letter. He paused to collect himself. Thanks to you, I had your address, but I can barely remember the roads in Seoul, much less recognize the city at all. He would never be able to tell his story if ever suggestion of his absence choked him to silence. We waited quietly with the patience born of 11 years. I heard leaves blowing in the wind and acorns falling from our last oak tree. Their hollow plops in the courtyard reminded me of the bitter acorn porridge we ate last winter and how our fingers blistered from shelling the dry and frozen meat. Calvin mopped his eyes, cleared his throat, looked straight at me and said, "My apologies." I mouthed, "None needed," and we smiled at this small exchange between us. So Calvin explains how Tongxiang happened to be at the hotel right at that moment, and he recognized Calvin from the wedding pictures and said, "Oh my God, it's you. And so they had this hugely coincidental reunion, which is true. And then he brought him to the house. Calvin says, once he identified himself, I got the Jeep and he showed me the way. He's told me something of your years of difficulties, and I was very sorry to hear these things. I must ask again your forgiveness." He stopped. As he gathered himself, Grandfather said, "There is no blame, and so no need for forgiveness." His eyes met mine for a flick of a moment, less than a glance, but I understood with the convincing truth of tears that my father had spoken to both my husband and me. Combined with Calvin's presence, my father's words released a weight that had crowded my soul since leaving Kaesong. This physical sensation and my enormous gratitude untethered me to an emotion so rich, I felt that if I were to lift my eyes to see my husband and my family in this room all around me, I fly into the heavens, soaring with light. Thank you.
Our final author is Yuliana Kim-Grant. She received her MFA in creative writing fiction from Emerson College. She lives here in New York City with her husband and son, and tonight she will read from her debut novel, A Shred of Hope. Please welcome Yuliana Kim-Grant.
Impossible to follow the two of you. This sucks. Sorry if I disappoint. Thank you, Korean American Story, for putting this amazing, beautiful night of women writers and Korean American, and to HJ and the Korea Society for hosting this event. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about where I'm going to read from. Mrs. Park has lost her daughter, and she had been estranged from her daughter for 12 years because her daughter had married someone who was African American. So in the midst of her grief, she finally comes out to go back to work, and she teaches music appreciation at a community college. And while she's sort of venturing forth, she strikes up a semi-relationship with one of her students who actually happens to be African American. And she had offered to the student that she could come and practice the piano in her room at any time. And so that's where, and I read this section because for this character, this is a real turning point for her. I think it's the one moment where she realizes that she could carry on in spite of all the loss. 2 days later, she sat in her office, again, biding time, but hugely relieved to be here rather than at home. Her sense of responsibility demanded that she be there during her office hours, despite the fact no student ever showed up, even to complain about her toughing grading this semester. She opened her top desk drawer, sorting out old pens, tossing those with dried ink. The small boombox she used for her classes played an Aretha Franklin album, another one of Jane's CDs she had brought from home. She loved the phrasing, the looseness of the singer's approach to the lyrics, forever coming in just under the beat. She hummed along with the now familiar refrain. A tentative knock made her stop her humming in mid-note. Instead of asking whoever was behind the door to come in, she got up to open it herself. Half expecting to see one of her colleagues, she opened the door just enough to invite polite conversation and was unable to hide her surprise in seeing Tanya, who stood, books to her chest, as if she were shielding herself from whatever onslaught was surely going to be directed at her. "Tanya, what a surprise. Come in," she said, opening the door wider, stepping aside to let the young girl in. I was wondering if I can see you're busy," Tanya stammered. Mrs. Park remembered that she had promised to open her classroom door for her. She noticed the stack of sheet music Tanya was clutching to her chest, the protective stance betraying her shyness and vulnerability. Mrs. Park fought her curiosity to see what Tanya had chosen to practice. "It's Wednesday. I'm sorry. Let me grab my key and I'll open the classroom for you," she said, rushing to her desk drawer for the ring, which held an assortment of keys to her office, classroom, faculty lounge, and mailroom. "It's okay if you're too busy, I understand." Mrs. Park replied she was hardly busy since no one ever showed up for office hours. She even flung her arms over her desk, which exposed her idleness of the past hour. With her keys in hand, she and Tanya headed toward the empty classroom and the awaiting piano. Mrs. Park's pleasure with Tanya for taking her up on her casual invitation surprised her. With the lights flicked on, she turned to go, leaving Tanya alone to her music, but then paused to assure Tanya that she could stay as long as she wanted. "The classroom will be empty," she explained. Tanya stood between Mrs. Park and the piano, still clutching her music. "I live with my aunt right now, and she doesn't have a piano," Tanya said, offering an explanation for an unasked question. "My mom, she's away." Afraid of what other confessions Tanya would reveal about the struggles in her life, Mrs. Park turned to sit at the piano playing a C chord. She patted the bench, inviting Tanya to sit down and play. Would you play something, Mrs. Park?" Tanya asked shyly. Not wanting to disappoint her, Mrs. Park warmed up by playing some scales, letting her fingers reacquaint themselves. She played the undulating notes of the Adagio sostenuto of Beethoven's Piano Sonata No. 14, Op. 27, the Moonlight Sonata, her fingers retracing the familiar ostinato triplet rhythm, her right hand picking out the haunting melody. Her mind filled with the picture of her husband as a young man sitting next to her as she played this piece for him. Although their bodies had barely touched, tension crackled between them, making Mrs. Park acutely aware of his presence as her fingers felt their way to chords long memorized. She tried to control her fingering to play in the pianissimo that Beethoven had expressly directed, her focus distracted by the musky scent of his aftershave. The lamentation of the melody seemed to fill in the unspoken words rarely expressed between a Korean man and a Korean woman, finally given an arena for experience and expression. Whenever she'd sit down to play, something she did frequently in the beginning of their marriage, she would eventually end up playing this piece, in essence, performing for him. With the many disappointments she experienced during the course of her marriage, she stopped playing for him, but instead played to express the music's moaning for the unattainable, now her own moaning. As the music built, imploring in each progression, Mrs. Park tried to imagine Dr. Park's embarrassment if he were to walk in on this intimate performance. Would his surprise and predictable blundering make Tanya feel ill at ease, as if she and Mrs. Park had been doing something illicit? Her anger bubbled quickly to the surface, making her foot pump harder on the pedal, caring not a whit for Beethoven's dictate for pianissimo. Her eyes watered, her body taut with rage and grief. Pulled under by the tow of all her emotion, she played with intensity and abandon, almost as an apology. All of her melancholy and passion Mirroring the music's grave, meditative melody directed her fingers to hit a note louder, to linger on a key for longer than was customary. To her trained ear, her playing sounded theatrical, the mezzo forte sounding more forte, her right hand fingering almost sloppy, her technique all but abandoned. She played as a young lover begging his beloved, his plea, one long, sonorous cry of anguish and yearning. Her right hand climbed the progression of notes like a lover climbing the stairs to his desire above, her eyes closed. As the music made its descent, she pictured young love thwarted, each step down the sweeping staircase a resignation to what can never be. Her closed eyes were moist, preventing her from looking up after the piano had quieted and her hands remained still in the ready position. Beethoven, Tanya asked timidly. Thank you.
Okay, now I get to fulfill my dream of being Oprah. Ladies, please come up to the... So if anyone has a question for any of the authors, please line up here at the microphone at any time.
Anytime.
Can I just sit down and talk?
Sure. Is that on?
Right? I should look at the Miss Chung because I read your book, and when I was starting reading your book, I thought I'm going to read a detective story the way you described the Hannah disappeared. Years ago, when I was reading some of the books written by other Korean Americans, the book usually start out describing very authoritarian, abusive father, and sometimes beat them, yell at them, and one after the other. So I, being one of the first generation men, a Korean man, I thought some tough guy, but we're not all that mean and bad. And I was just afraid of what American people would characterize the culture of Korean old people. Now, as the story went on, I must ask, I imagine it's a true story based on your family episode. It's not total fabrication, right? So,
is that your question?
It's your family's true story, right?
No.
Oh,
no!
so
I don't have a sister. Our family's not cursed that I know of to this
Wow.
daughter, which would
Her
be terrible
father's
because I'm the
womb.
only daughter.
See? I'm glad I came to ask this question.
yeah,
So
no.
there's no person like a Hannah. I was about to ask you where Hannah is, where she's living.
There's no Hannah. Yeah.
So
It's amazing.
I'm so sorry.
It's amazing.
So, Catherine, what was the inspiration for your book?
Oh, that's such a hard question to answer. I think inspiration is this very difficult thing to pinpoint because it's very elusive, and when it comes, sometimes it comes and you think it's inspiration and it leads you nowhere. We were talking a little bit before this, and I was talking about how, the story isn't autobiographical in that I don't think that the events of the book line up with the events of my life, but at the same time, I feel like, your book is everything you have been thinking about up until the time that you write it. And with your first book, it's like everything you've been thinking about your whole life. And I think that your life presents certain questions and certain problems, and that the book is sort of the moment that you get to explore those questions or those issues, if that makes sense. And when I wrote this book, I was in my 20s. And I think that the things that I was working through at the time were questions of identity, obviously, right? And also, a along with that, like how do you think you're going to end up one kind of person and then discover that you're a totally different kind of person? And what are the kinds of stories that shape who you think you're going to become, and how do those stories not end up actually fitting your life? And what do you do when that happens? If that makes sense.
Interesting. Yuliana, what was the inspiration for your book?
I had a friend who actually lost her only child, her son, and he was 32 at the time. And it was sort of profound for me to watch her grieve her only child. And so that was a launching off point for me. I wanted to explore what it was like for women of that generation when, in a lot of ways, they had to define their identity through family and their children. Like Kathy, I think that some of the details of my life will, measure up in that, my husband is African American. I am Korean. I am obviously still alive. But
No.
yeah, exactly. But beyond that, I think the story is really about these two mothers and the grief that they have to cope with, but also, more importantly, their relationship with each other, which gets foisted upon them because of the marriage of their children. So, I mean, it's interesting because I'm working on a book now that is in some ways my adolescent book. Like I should have written when I was in my 20s, but I'm writing now in a very advanced stage. And I'm working through some of these other questions that I think I need to answer for myself.
Eugenia, first of all, the talk that you gave before you read was so interesting because I've read all of your books and loved your book as I did all of them, but especially knowing that it was based on your mother's story just makes it even more incredible. So what did your mother think after the book was done?
Unfortunately, she didn't live to see the book done. But I asked her. I wanted to have her permission to write this story because it was her story, and so she was Korean. I was American. We didn't have such a great relationship, to be honest. So when I asked her, of course, she only spoke to me in Korean, and I only spoke to her in English. But somehow, we continued to misunderstand each other, which was on my part sometimes deliberate, and probably on hers as well. But we managed to talk enough because I understood enough to be able to have somewhat of a conversation. So I asked her, is it okay if I write your story? And she just shrugged and turned her head. And I took that to mean two things. Not that no one would be interested in her story because she had a healthy ego. So I knew that she thought her stories were interesting. But more that it wouldn't amount to anything. My attempts would. So that's how I took it. On the other hand, that's, my daughter's stuff, But then the more I started to interview her and ask her things that were very specific about, I said, so when you first met, Dad, what did you do? How did you, because your parents were there, and how did that go down? And she would be, she'd be looking at me like I was crazy. Well, of course we did this and this and this. That's what every Korean family does. And I realized I didn't know. There was so much I didn't know. And so part of my inspiration for writing this book was not just to explore her life, but to explore more about the culture from which I had originated, but which I knew so little about. And so, like Kathy was saying, we have these questions and we bring them into our novels. And I definitely, she did hers in her 20s and 30s. My quest for identity started much later in my 40s and 50s. And so, but those were the questions that I was addressing for myself. What does it mean to be Korean American? What does it mean to be Korean? And what does it mean as an American being a Korean? And so only to answer that question, I had to investigate so much more about Korea than I had ever known. And that was a journey that led me to accept and really embrace the concept and the belief of Korean Americanism.
come up to the microphone, please. Thank you.
Yeah, I'm really struck. I met HJ tonight for the first time. Now I consider him a brother, but just this concept of story and Korean American story. And then I was struck by this other gentleman who I'll call a brother here, who was talking about, hey, it was kind of a rough time on these Korean American males. And I'm thinking, you got to write a whole body of literature, read The Color Purple, about hardships on African American males and how you feel about yourself after you read a body of literature. I'm curious, with the panel, A, what's the pressure, and B, what's the feeling to tell stories that have not been heard that are American stories? I'm just curious.
Would you tell us who you are?
There's another brother here who's really talks literature. Yeah, I'm just a guy who's here. I happen to know one of the authors up here pretty well. But,
Can I tell? So this is Yuliana's husband.
Oh my God! So
Thank you, Jay.
God, he's so gorgeous.
Go ahead.
I'm actually speechless, which is a rarity. I think part of my drive to write is I read my whole life, and yet I never encountered stories that felt like home to me. And I think we talked about James Baldwin. There are certainly certain writers of color that spoke to that sense of otherness and isolation and being on the margins of society, more or less. But I never had the stories that spoke to me. And I think for me, it's been amazing to find all these Korean and then women, Korean American authors to tell these stories. And the multitude of stories that we have to tell, I think, is what's amazing. And so, I dedicated my first book to my mother and my mother-in-law because I felt like that's a generation of women whose stories haven't really been told. And so, it's a very profound question and one that I think about a lot when I do work.
I don't want to turn this into the evening of James Baldwin, but I was thinking as Yuliana was talking that the thing that I loved about James Baldwin when I read him for the first time was his absolute refusal to be defined by other people. He just took what everyone was saying about the kind of person he was and exploded it, really, and claimed a sort of humanity for himself that was so startling to me to read for the first time. And I think that there is a tremendous amount of pressure when you are writing stories that haven't been published and that you haven't read a lot of before. But I try to ignore that pressure, actually, because I think that it's not useful. And I think that if you are influenced by that kind of pressure too much, then you're not actually telling your story, right? And you're not actually finding your voice. So
I want to address the piece that he mentioned in his question about the father, the stereotype of the the mean and that's very stern and the non-emotional father. There's a reason why that stereotype exists. And that was true in my novel as well. The grandfather is the antagonist. He's the antagonist of this young girl who is just exploding to be, more than what's allowed her. So, and, you get book reviews and you might have 100 really great reviews, but the one that is kind of critical, you never forget. Well, that was true of me. And the comment that the reviewer made was that the father is a trope. He's a stereotypical figure. Mm-hmm. And we are so tired of this. Why is she doing this? And it really hurt to hear that. But I also realized that towards the end, I worked really hard to investigate who he was and what he was struggling with. Somebody asked me just recently about how does your story apply to what's happening in contemporary America today? Well, what a strange question, but the first thing I thought of was Downton Abbey.
Yeah.
Believe it or not. You know, the man in the family is struggling to hold on to culture, his tradition and his old culture, and it's an aristocratic one. Well, the father in this story is doing the same kind of thing. And so when I thought more about her criticism, and I thought about who I had created this character to be, who he developed into being on his own, I realized that I was okay with it. And so the answer then is, it's not about the trope, it's about who that character is. Who is that person? Isn't that what we all are trying to do here, both in our art and in being here tonight, is to understand each other, you know, as individuals, as people, as not as just Korean Americans, but also as, you know, the crazy three writers up here.
Yeah, I think there's a weird pressure, especially when you're a writer of color, and also actually when you're a woman writer, that your writing will be representational, right? Mm-hmm. So that it's not a story that adds to the body of literature, but that it's a story that tells the world what it's like to be this kind of person. And mm-hmm. I think that's not always helpful.
No, it's not at all. Yeah,
it's unfair.
Good night. Thank you so much. Yuliana touched on the question that I had, but I'm very curious. You guys have, I think, multiple books, and there's a debut novel, I think.
We're all debut.
Oh, is it all debut?
Yeah.
Okay, all right. So I think Kathy had mentioned that a lot of kind of what's been written, you know, you've been kind of, it's been itching inside of you. You've been wanting to kind of get it out. I understand that. So what's next? I know you mentioned kind of what's next, you know, talking about, you know, your next book is going to be more of a kind of a childhood book. I'm assuming like a memoir type.
No.
Maybe, no? Okay. No. All right. Well, that's the question. What's next?
No, it's another novel. Okay. I don't have the courage. Actually, I think my family would sue me if I wrote a memoir, so I don't want to deal with litigation. It's my fucked up book. Like, how do I say it? Excuse the language. It's my 20-something, I'm fucked up, but she's 30-something and kind of screwed up, and she undergoes some tragic things, and it's about that sense of period in your life when you're trying to figure out who you are. And then coupled with her sense of place and identity in this greater world. So that's what I mean, like, that should have been my first book I should have written, but apparently I didn't. I always do things backwards. So I wrote this really mature first book, I guess, about these old women, you know, and now I'm writing about somebody who's much younger than I am, but is more contemporary in a certain kind of way, I think.
I'm working on another novel about actually female mathematicians at the beginning of the 20th century.
That's
and
great.
So that's actually been really fun and exciting.
Yeah. I'm working on another novel, yes.
There we go.
You know, I think every novelist's fear is that, I don't know if you guys feel this way, but that you only have one book in you. We are all debut novelists, and that certainly was a huge fear of mine, is that I only have one book. This is it. And, you know, and it's 500 pages, so forget it. There's no more coming out of me. But the urge to ask these questions persists. And so you find that there are ways to frame those questions in a story. It's not, the inspiration will come somehow. So that's, you know, I don't really want to talk about what's next because it's so hard. Yeah. And I don't know if it's going to be any good, so, you know. Yeah.
I do.
You stop.
I want to just mention that the questioner is also a writer, and he's working on a phenomenal book.
Great.
Milton.
Oh, yeah. Thank you.
I was just wondering, is there something that you wanted to say? Because I don't know, like when you know, when you're writing the novels, is there something you just wanted to say to people through the artistry?
Did you have a message?
You know, I did so much research for this book, and one of the things that I discovered was that there were very few stories about women in the colonial period. And so I wanted to redress that. Now there have been more published. There's been more translated in English. This was really true, but and hearing just so that was part of my agenda, and the other agenda, I've already mentioned, was who am I? Who am I?
Was there something? Yes, I think there was something I wanted to say. But I don't know that I can articulate it very well. I think that I needed a novel to articulate whatever it was that I wanted to say.
Right.
Yeah.
I didn't have any. I just wanted to write this book about these two women. And my process is so, it makes my husband kind of crazy. I write line by line, and I think for all of us, this book I'm working on now, it was the voice. I heard this character's voice so distinctly. With this first book, it was about these women and sort of understanding that I wanted to tell the scope of their story. So I don't think that I ever, and I don't have an audience. I don't have a question that I think it's more like a quest of discovering where the stories will take you, I think. That is for me.
Good.
I was actually, that's an interesting point. I was going to ask you, when you're writing, is there sort of a process, like, do you get in this zone? I've heard of artists who say that when they're really deep in their work, it's almost as if they're just the medium almost. It's like the work is coming through them. Does that happen with you, or something?
The first book, it happened, and that's what captured me about writing. The second book, now it's just hard work. I'm sorry. It's just hard work. You just go to that page and you just look at it, and a word will come, if you're lucky. It's hard work.
Yes. Oh, yeah. No. What was the question?
Is there
while you're
the
writing,
magical process?
is this?
Oh.
There's moments where you feel like...
Yeah.
Where you lose time.
I think I write, and my impulse to write is because I like the sense of what if and discovering. And so there is a moment where, I work line by line. I could never tell you where anything was going to go. And the characters take on a life of their own, and they'll take a right turn somewhere, and you go, oh my God, really? How interesting. And I think for me, it's the way your unconscious, subconscious, your conscious comes to life in some way, and the ways, the details of life that you take in that you don't even understand you're taking in, and it gets put on the page. And that's that sense of discovery of that's how crazy my mind is. You know what I mean? That's what I find so exciting about writing.
I do have those weird moments where you're possessed. And then at the end of it, you're just like, who wrote that? But those moments are really rare. Yes. And really rare. And most of it is just a lot of work. Yeah.
I remember once coming out of one of those rare moments, and I looked at the page and I was crying, and I thought, oh, damn, I'm good. We
should end on that note.
That's how rare that is.
That's a good one.
That's so great. Are there any more questions from the audience?
Great, thank you so much.
More words on
Sure.
now that I knew
Yeah.
it was not your family story.
Also, the father in the book is very nice.
Yes, he
So
is.
you all know.
He's
Yes,
very
he's
nice.
actually-
Yes.
he's very,
You must do great research in Korea, how the medicine is delivered, what the family structure,
Right.
dynamics and all that. You did make the research actually. Otherwise, you cannot describe such tedious process of cancer treatment.
Oh.
Having said that, for maybe next book or future, I thought your book would have additional dimension and the power if you could describe how your their parents pay the bill in Korea.
Ah.
You see, because without having insurance,
They sold the
even you
house.
had
They
insurance
sold the
in
house,
Korea,
didn't they? Yeah.
the enormous hospitalization cost or medicine is good enough to break ordinary families' back of checkbook account. So the people from Korea, America, to go to Korea, go through that hardship to survive. And there comes another human driver, a big, big dynamic issue of Korean society. And I'm glad that Hana's sister did come back to America to start the work again. So anyway, so I must congratulate.
Yeah. I also want to add that a lot of what he's asking, Catherine, if I can say, is that it's because her book is so authentic. There's a real sense of authenticity. So, he keeps asking, is this real? Because it sure sounds real. Yeah.
I will also say that clinical trials or a lot of experimental treatment for cancer is paid for by the trial itself,
Yeah.
and not
true.
by the patients. So it changes things.
Yeah.
maybe.
And I've
But
heard
thank
that too,
you.
to go to Korea is to get the better treatments. Oh, why can't we drink yet? I know, really. One more last one.
Before we go home, I have had a very serious question before I came here, so I have to ask you. I'm the first generation and about 8 years here and raising a child. And I am doing a very persistent and deliberate effort to teach her my language, but it's not working.
Right.
So I'm asking myself, beyond kimchi and Gangnam Style,
Yeah.
what could be there to inherit my child as a person who came from Korea? And now you wrote a book, and I am asking, how much Korean do you speak? Because you call yourself Korean American. It means you have something Korean culture you value in yourself, and it show up in your books, right?
Yes.
So what does the language mean to you?
Yeah. It has always been a point of shame in my life that I have not been able to speak Korean properly. I could speak like a 4-year-old, because that's where I stopped speaking Korean. So, I took lessons when I was in my late 40s, but it was too late already. It was already so difficult to be learning again this difficult language. What I want to tell you, and what I wish I could tell your child, is take these lessons. They are so valuable to you. And it's one of the reasons why I could never really accept my Korean American identity, was because I didn't have the original language. I didn't have my mother tongue. How do we understand each other if we cannot understand each other's language? So every key to every culture is through the language. And so, I don't, it's always been a point of real, utter shame, such that I would go into the corner market and be afraid that to say anything to the Korean shopkeeper, because I would be seen as a complete idiot. So it's an issue. It's definitely a cultural issue, and I think an issue of the generation, which is one of the reasons why I'm so glad to see in the Washington area, at least, there are active classes in the language in LA and New York. I'm sure that's true, and they are really well attended. But most of the people are older; they're in their 20s or 30s. So.
Korean was my first language, even though I was born in the States, and my mom is here. Hi, Mom. And
Hey, Mom.
and she only speaks Korean to me.
Right.
Yeah,
Right.
she only speaks Korean to me, and I mostly speak Korean to her. And it's this weird. I dream in Korean. I think certain thoughts only in Korean and never in English. And I think it's such an important thing, right? Like as the link to where you're from and where your parents are from, to be able to talk to them in their language and to be yelled at in their language.
Right.
But yeah, no, it's actually funny. I think that when I went to school for the first time, it was this tremendous shock because I didn't speak English and I learned it in school, and so it's always been this different relationship that I've had with English.
Yeah, and yet your English writing is, unbelievable. So
Thank you.
well done.
Thank you.
As your second language, Yuliana.
I think I speak it really well, but my family may say differently. I think it's interesting that I'm sitting between the two of you because I think I'm the in-between generation in some ways. I was born in Korea, and my first language is Korean, but then I lost it all. And my parents' generation, we didn't have Korean language schools. It was all about assimilation. So my Korean is actually really, really, it stinks actually. And it was something that I'm still very ashamed of in some ways. I didn't learn to read and write until I went to university and took Korean at school. And then the Korean professor just took me aside and said, "You shouldn't come back."
Oh my God.
Because all I wanted to do was talk about Korean food. But, so it's something that I struggle with, but my mom and dad speak to me in Korean, and I can answer in Korean, and then there are words that I have no idea what they are, so I'll say it in English. So I think my husband will say that it's the craziest thing to hear us speaking, because it's like we speak in 3-4 different languages, and we all understand each other. So,
or you hope you understand each other.
But it's amazing how well people can understand each other. I feel like particularly second-generation Korean Americans who say, I don't speak any Korean, but they understand everything their parents say. Yeah. And I remember when I was like 8 years old, my brother and I stopped speaking Korean for like a year or two. We were just like, we can't speak it. We don't understand. And then I don't know what happened, but it was this weird psychological thing. And then after it passed, I could speak it again. So.
Interesting.
Yeah, but I feel like a lot of people think they can't speak Korean, but somehow they actually have it. They understand it.
Oh, I know it's in there. It's just not coming out here.
Yeah, exactly.
Right. And then this isn't, so my husband's not Korean. I'm raising a child who thinks he's very Korean. And he speaks zero Korean other than identifying food names again, like his mother. And it's something that I struggle with because I do want him to learn the language, but, and it's hard because I don't speak Korean day to day. It's not my first language in some ways. I mean, yes, if I'm with my parents, but I don't wake up and go speak to him Korean. So it's a thing that I struggle with profoundly because I do want him to learn and he wants to learn, but I don't have the capacity to do it on some level.
Yeah. My mother tried to teach me. This is what I learned. 이것이 노란 연필입니다. This is a yellow pencil. So how useful is that?
For a writer, it's pretty useful.
Although we don't use pencils at all. Right? Yeah.
Thank you so much to our 3 authors and for everyone who joined us tonight. Please, if you haven't already, enjoy some refreshments in the back.